Welcome to Footnotes for Rent-Free History. This will be for shorter topics that I don't think could sustain a long enough episode, so I'm just going to talk about them here. The first episode will be on the rise of edge culture and shock jock radio. Now, in the 90s, being offensive wasn't just tolerated, it was profitable. If you wanted to understand American media in the late 90s, you didn't start with television. You started with radio. Because before podcasts, before YouTube, before social media, there was one voice blasting through morning commutes across the country: Howard Stern. Whether you loved him or you hated him, you were listening. To understand why shock jock radio mattered, you kind of have to put yourself in the perspective of that era. The internet existed, but barely. Most households still didn't have it. Cable television, expanding, but it wasn't endless. There weren't the 2,000 channels that nobody pays for nowadays anyways, competing for your attention. Radio still felt intimate. It was in your car, in your kitchen, in your headphones at work. And talk radio in particular was booming. Syndication deals were expanding reach. The 1996 Telecommunications Act loosened ownership restrictions, allowing media consolidation on a scale America hadn't seen since the previous decade with the deregulation of television. Personalities suddenly go national like that. That environment created the perfect conditions for someone willing to push further than anyone else. Now, Howard Stern didn't invent outrageous radio. Shock jocks existed long before him, going back to the 70s, but Stern understood something fundamental about attention. If people are angry, they stay. Fine line between hate and love. His show blurred the line between performance and authenticity. Staff arguments became his content. Celebrity interviews became confrontational theater. Taboo topics weren't avoided, and they were spotlighted. Crucially, every fine from the Federal Communications Commission, or FCC, wasn't just punishment, it was promotion. The more he was censored, the more rebellious he appeared. In the 90s, rebellion sold. By the mid-90s, Stern wasn't just some fringe provocateur broadcasting from the margins. He was mainstream enough to release a major motion picture, Private Parts, about his own life. A shock jock biopic as a studio release. Couldn't imagine that nowadays. That alone tells you something about the cultural temperature. But this wasn't just about one personality. It's about a shift in what audiences valued. Now, the 90s were a decade of cultural contradiction. On the surface, there was prosperity, economic growth, optimism. Cold War's over. Technology felt exciting. Clinton's here, and we don't know what he's done yet. But culturally, there was also a hunger for disruption. Grunge already tore down the polished 80s excess. Reality TV is starting to creep into the mainstream programming with shows like The Real World. Professional wrestling was leaning harder into chaos and adult themes with its Attitude Era. And tabloid journalism was just thriving with stories like the O.J. Simpson trial and the Menendez brothers. Never get that right. The thought line was simple. Edgy felt honest. If something offended someone, it must be real. If it broke decorum, it must be authentic. Shock jock radio didn't just create that hunger, it responded to it. And Stern, in many ways, became the avatar of that appetite. He wasn't just shocking for the sake of it. He was selling transparency, messiness, a kind of unfiltered access that traditional media just didn't provide at the time. Listeners felt like they were feeling something raw, something real. And in that moment in time, that felt revolutionary. It's important to note how that outrage traveled differently then. There was no Twitter, no viral clips spreading globally in minutes. If you were offended by something said on the radio, you wrote a letter. You filed a complaint. You talked about it at work the next day. Controversy had friction, and that friction gave shock value weight, gave it scarcity. Today, outrage is ambient. It's everywhere, all the time. In 1996, it was concentrated. And concentration amplifies power. Stern understood the economy of the attention before we had the language for it. If half the country is angry and the other half is entertained, you've captured both sides. Either way, they're tuning in. That formula would echo across the next few decades. 85 onward, after he gets fired from WNBC and goes on to his own terrestrial radio station, until about 2006, when he signs with Sirius XM, or at the time, just Sirius. Reality television had leaned into humiliation and confrontation. Cable news had been rewarding volume over nuance, and internet culture eventually weaponized provocation as currency. The idea that attention is attention didn't begin online. It matured on terrestrial radio. But here's where reflection matters. Was Shock Jock Radio a cause of edge culture or a mirror of it? That's harder to answer. It's tempting to look back and say that this was the beginning of outrage as a business, but it really is more complicated than that. Stern operated within constraints. FCC fines were real. Broadcast standards were rigid. They were boundaries, and pushing against them created drama. Today, many of those structural boundaries barely even exist online nowadays. Platforms are decentralized, regulation is inconsistent, the scale is global. Shock no longer feels rebellious in the same way, much as in the way that Sonic the Hedgehog never doesn't feel like he has attitude anymore, the way he did in 1991. In the 90s, pushing past the line felt dangerous. Now it often feels algorithmic. There's a difference between rebellion and strategy. And that might be the real legacy of shock radio. Once corporations saw that anger, kept audiences engaged, edginess stopped being a countercultural thing and started being profitable at a scale. The outsider became the insider. 30 years later, look back at it now. Howard Stern has changed. Tone softened, interviews became more introspective, he moved platforms. This rebellious outsider matured into an establishment figure, and the evolution is telling. Because it suggests that shock, as a permanent posture, is unsustainable. Audiences eventually normalize it. What's once felt dangerous becomes routine. Edge culture has to escalate to maintain impact, and escalation eventually exhausts itself. Tuning into shock radio in the 90s, 2000s, 80s, 70s felt like stepping into something slightly forbidden. Today, almost quaint. Not because it wasn't influential, but because the ecosystem it disrupted no longer exists. So when we look back at the rise of shock radio, it's less about crude jokes or FCC fines. It's about a media turning point, a moment where personality overtook polish, when authenticity, or at least the performance of authenticity, became more valuable than professionalism. When outrage proved it could be monetized. Shock radio didn't invent that instinct, but it refined it. And once refined, it never really left. It just changed platforms. Years later, the question isn't whether shock culture won, it's whether we even recognize it as shock anymore. And maybe that's the strangest part of all. Because what once felt like a rebellion now feels like a routine. And the thing about a routine is, it doesn't feel dangerous. It just feels normal. I'm Kem Diwosio. Thank you for watching.